Ever feel like when you're learning about history, it's always just like the same old stories, like the mainland's greatest hits?
Yeah, just the big events, the famous names.
Exactly. Well, today we're taking a detour, going to explore some hidden histories.
We're venturing out to the edges, you could say.
Yeah, to the islands of Britain.
And I think that's what makes Alice Albini's book, The Britannia, so fascinating.
It is.
It takes us on this journey through time,
A journey through time.
specifically the 16th and 17th centuries.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it shows how these often overlooked islands,
Overlooked, yeah.
they actually hold all these crucial clues to understanding British history as a whole.
And maybe even ourselves.
Absolutely.
Now we're talking about a period of intense change, right? Henry VIII, the rise of Protestantism, the beginnings of colonialism.
It's all happening.
Yeah, it's like a whirlwind of activity. And all of that swirling around these islands, shaping their destinies in some pretty dramatic ways.
Yeah, and our first stop takes us to Lindisfarne, an island that really embodies this clash between the old and the new.
I like that, the old and the new.
And you can just imagine standing there with the ruins of the Lindisfarne Priory on one side.
Oh, wow.
It's a reminder of that monastic life that once thrived there.
Yeah.
And on the other side, this imposing castle built by Henry VIII.
It's like a physical manifestation of that power shift.
Right, exactly.
Like from the monasteries to the crown.
Yeah, and you can practically feel the ground shifting beneath your feet
Oh, yeah, I see that.
as one era crumbles and a new one rises up in its place.
Now, for those of us who maybe need a little refresher on this period,
Sure.
what exactly did the dissolution of the monasteries actually entail?
Well, it wasn't just about closing down buildings.
Okay.
It was a systematic dismantling of a whole way of life
Oh, wow.
that had existed for centuries.
Yeah, centuries.
And these monasteries weren't just spiritual centers.
Right.
They were hubs of social and economic activity.
Okay.
People made pilgrimages to these places seeking solace and connection and even healing.
And all of that's gone now.
It is.
Lindisfarne, with its, that contrast between those ruins and those fortifications, it really drives home the magnitude of that loss.
It does, and it's a loss that we can still feel even today, even if we don't necessarily make pilgrimages in the same way.
I feel that.
That longing for connection,
Yeah,
for something bigger than ourselves, it's still a part of our human experience.
definitely. From the echoes of Lindisfarne, we then journey to Rathlin Island,
Okay.
which is nestled in the Irish Sea between Ireland and Scotland.
Got it.
This island was a vital link between Gaelic clans.
It was a place where cultures intertwined.
Yeah, where traditions were celebrated.
Albania describes a wedding that united clans from both lands.
Oh, wow.
And it really symbolized this shared heritage and vibrant cultural exchange.
Beautiful.
But Rathlin's strategic location,
Very
she
good.
calls it a lay-by island.
A lay-by island.
Yeah, it's like a vital stopping point for seafarers.
I see.
But unfortunately, that also made it a target
Oh, no.
for English expansion.
This is where things start to take a turn, right?
They do.
A dark turn. Rathlin becomes the site of some horrific massacres.
Unfortunately, yeah.
First under Queen Mary and then again under Queen Elizabeth.
Wow.
I mean, the brutality, the swiftness of the violence.
It's truly shocking.
Yeah, it is.
And, these events on Rathlin,
Yeah.
they foreshadow this darker side of English colonialism.
Okay.
This brutal reality of conquest and domination that unfortunately would play out
Right.
on a much larger scale in other parts of the world.
It makes you think about those islanders.
Yeah.
And the terror they must have felt.
Yeah.
Going from celebration to just unimaginable carnage in such a short span of time.
I know, it really makes you think about the violence that so often lurks beneath the surface of history.
It does.
Mm.
And what makes Rathlin's story even more, poignant, I guess, is Ireland's unique position at the time.
Right.
I mean, relatively untouched by previous conquest.
Right.
Ireland held on to its ancient myths and traditions.
Yeah, it's like this clash of two worlds.
Oh, yeah.
This ancient culture coming head on with this force, determined to reshape it.
To reshape it in his own image.
Exactly.
Do you think this clash is reflected at all in the literature of the time?
Oh, absolutely. Edmund Spenser, he was a colonist in Ireland himself.
Okay.
He grappled with these complexities in his epic poem, The Fairy Queen.
Oh, okay.
And his depictions of powerful women on islands.
Women on islands?
Yeah, both alluring and threatening. They reflect these anxieties of the age.
The Fairy Queen. It's a classic, right? Packed with knights and magic and, of course, some Pretty evocative island imagery.
It is.
So I'm sensing a connection here.
There definitely is. Spencer's experiences in Ireland, combined with his exposure to Irish folklore.
Right.
They likely influence his portrayal of these female figures.
These figures who embody both the beauty and the danger of the untamed right.
Exactly. The allure and threat of what lies beyond the familiar.
There's that theme again, isn't there? Women in islands, it's like this potent mix that both fascinates and unsettles those in power.
It does. And one particularly striking passage in The Fairy Queen describes the destruction of Acrasia's island paradise.
Oh, wow.
And the language that Spencer uses.
Huh.
Their bliss, he turned to balefulness. Their groves, he felt. It mirrors the devastation that the colonizers inflicted on the Irish landscape.
Almost as if Spencer's wrestling with his own complicity in all this.
Yeah.
Using the poem to kind of explore the complex dynamics of power and conquest.
Right.
In the clash of cultures.
And don't forget, he was serving a female monarch.
Oh, that's right. Queen Elizabeth.
Exactly.
So that adds another layer to his portrayal of female power and leadership.
It does.
Something he seems to both admire and fear.
Absolutely.
Speaking of powerful female figures, we can't really talk about islands and literature without mentioning Shakespeare's The Tempest.
Such a great play.
It really is. A play steeped in island imagery, and it was inspired by real-life colonial encounters.
You're thinking of Bermuda, right?
Yes, that island paradise.
Or at least it was perceived that way back then.
Right.
Shakespeare drew on those accounts of the Sea Venture shipwreck.
Oh.
And the abundance that was found on that island.
Right.
And he blended it with other colonial narratives to create this sort of archetypal colonial island setting.
I see. What always struck me about The Tempest is the character of Sycorax Caliban's mother.
Right.
She's labeled a witch.
She is.
And dispossessed of her island by Prospero.
There it is again, that recurring theme.
That recurring theme of women ruling islands.
Often demonizes witches.
Yeah, it's a trope that pops up throughout folklore and history.
It does.
It seems to reflect these deep-seated anxieties about female power.
Especially when it's connected to nature.
Yeah, to the untamed. But why witches, specifically? What was it about these women, these island women, that sparked such fear?
That's a great question, and it's one that I think takes us to the heart of these patriarchal anxieties.
Okay.
You see these women, their connection to nature, their perceived ability to control the elements, to tap into these unseen forces.
Yeah.
Well, it challenged the established order.
I see.
It was a power that couldn't be easily controlled or categorized.
And therefore it had to be demonized.
Exactly.
It's like they represented this wildness, this unpredictability that was both fascinating and frightening.
To those clinging to power.
Yeah. And it's interesting how this fear of the feminine, of the untamed, it just seems to play out again and again in history.
It does. And speaking of those who felt threatened by these island traditions, one ruler who comes to mind is James VI of Scotland.
James VI.
Who later became James III of England.
Ah, right. James VI, infamous for his obsession with witches.
He was.
Didn't he view islands with a great deal of suspicion?
He did. James VI inherited this long tradition of mainland monarchs viewing the periphery with this mix of anxiety and disdain.
Okay.
But for him, it went deeper than that.
Deeper, okay.
He saw these islands as direct threats to his authority.
Wow.
Places where old ways persisted.
Right.
And where whispers of rebellion lingered.
So it's like those islands held up a mirror to the anxieties of the ruling class.
Right.
Reflecting back all the things they feared the most.
Exactly. The loss of control.
The loss of control.
The persistence of alternative ways of being.
And, of course, the power of those they sought to dominate.
Absolutely. And perhaps nowhere is that more evident than in the enduring presence of the Sheela-na-gigs.
The Sheela-na-gigs?
Yeah, these ancient, often erotic sculptures of women, primarily found on islands. And they represent this form of cultural expression that defied mainland norms.
It's as if the islands provided this kind of protective buffer, a space where those traditions could endure even as they were being suppressed on the mainland.
There are these fascinating pockets of resistance.
Preserving what's been lost or forgotten elsewhere.
Exactly.
And that resistance wasn't just cultural, it extended to the political realm as well.
It did, especially during times of upheaval like the English Civil War. Think about it, both Charles I and his son Prince Charles sought refuge on islands like the Isles of Scilly, Jersey and the Isle of Wight.
It's remarkable how these seemingly remote outposts become so central to the power struggles unfolding on the mainland. It really highlights how interconnected everything is, and
Absolutely.
how even those on the margins can play such a crucial role.
Is shaping the course of history.
Yeah. And what's even more fascinating is how those island experiences shaped the individuals themselves.
Yes. Remember that description of Charles III unbuoying his son on the Isle of Wight?
Yes, preparing him for a life of potential exile.
Exactly. Such a powerful image.
It really captures that sense of displacement uncertainty.
And even a kind of forced maturity.
Yeah, that these islands imposed on those who sought refuge there.
It's a reminder that history isn't just some grand narrative unfolding on a distant stage,
No, yeah.
made up of countless individual stories,
Right.
many of which play out in these unexpected places.
Like those windswept islands.
On the periphery.
And those island stories, they often challenge us to rethink our assumptions about the past, don't they?
They do.
They offer a different perspective.
Yeah, a glimpse into the lives and experiences of those who are often overlooked in traditional historical accounts.
Speaking of overlooked perspectives, we keep returning to this theme of women ruling islands.
Yes.
It's a recurring motif in folklore mythology, even in the theater of the time.
It is.
What do you make of this enduring fascination?
Well, it's clearly a very powerful archetype,
It is.
one that taps into something deep within the human psyche.
Yeah.
And these figures, the ancient priestesses controlling the winds,
the ladies of the lake in Arthurian legend.
wielding this mystical power.
Yeah, they embody this different kind of authority.
One rooted in nature
Intuition.
and a connection to this unseen world.
It's like they represent this alternative to the patriarchal power structures that dominated society at the time.
They offer a vision of leadership
Yeah.
that's more in tune with the rhythms of nature.
Less focused on control and domination.
And more attuned to the needs of the community.
And perhaps that's why these figures are both celebrated and feared.
It's true.
They offer this glimpse of a different way of being, a different way of relating to power.
And that can be both alluring and unsettling
Yeah.
to those accustomed to traditional hierarchies.
It makes you wonder if those stories maybe served as a kind of cultural safety valve,
Yeah.
a way to explore those alternative models of leadership
Right.
without directly challenging the established order.
It's like saying, yes, there are other ways to lead other sources of power, but let's keep them safely contained
Safely contained.
within the realm of myth and legend.
That's a very insightful observation.
Thank you.
But it's also important to remember that these stories were often told by men, right?
There were.
Shaped by their own perspectives and anxieties.
Exactly.
So even as they celebrate female power, they often do so within the confines of these patriarchal narratives.
Absolutely. It's a complex dynamic,
It is.
reflecting these broader societal tensions surrounding gender and power during that era.
Tensions that are still very much with us today.
They are.
Absolutely. The fight for equal representation, for the right to lead, for the freedom to define our own roles in society, these are battles that have been waged for centuries.
I know.
And they're far from over.
Yeah.
It's sobering to realize how deeply ingrained those patterns of power and inequality really are.
It is, but it's also empowering to see how women throughout history have resisted those constraints,
Yeah.
carving out spaces for themselves, whether on literal islands or in the realm of ideas.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, from the spiritual upheaval of the dissolution to the brutal realities of colonialism and the enduring power of those island women who dared to defy convention. But there's still so much more to explore in the Britannias.
There is.
Join us for part 2 of our deep dive.
We'll delve even deeper into these fascinating island stories.
We'll be back soon to uncover more hidden connections, challenge more assumptions, and ultimately gain a richer understanding of ourselves and the world we inhabit.
Don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive.
Yeah, so you don't miss out on the next part of our journey.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Alice Albinia's The Britannias. You know, as we were talking about those themes of colonialism and the clash of cultures, it really struck me how islands often become these testing grounds, for ideas and practices that are later applied on a much larger scale.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. It's like there are these microcosms, these petri dishes, where the mainland can experiment with its ambitions and anxieties, often with pretty devastating consequences for the islanders themselves.
Precisely. And one ruler who embodies the 16th century mindset with a particular focus on islands is James VI of Scotland, who, as you'll recall later, became James I of England.
Ah, yes. James VI, the witch-obsessed king, who saw islands as these untamed, potentially dangerous spaces. He really seemed to fear what he couldn't directly control. What was it about these islands that made him so uneasy?
Well, you see, James VI, He inherited this long tradition of mainland monarchs viewing the periphery with suspicion. But for him, it went deeper than that.
People, okay.
He saw these islands as direct threats to his authority, places where those ancient traditions and beliefs persisted, resisting those homogenizing forces he was trying to impose on the realm.
It's almost like those islands held up a mirror to his own insecurities, right? Reflecting back a world that didn't conform to his vision of order and control.
Exactly. Those persistent whispers of different ways of being, different systems of belief, they must have been incredibly unsettling for someone so focused on centralizing power and imposing his will.
And do you think those anxieties were shared by others in the ruling class?
Oh, absolutely. We see echoes of this fear in the literature of the time, particularly in Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. Remember those depictions of powerful women on islands, both alluring and threatening.
Yeah.
They speak to those deep-seated anxieties about female authority and the perceived dangers of untamed nature.
It's fascinating how these themes intertwine. The fear of the feminine, the distrust of the periphery, and the drive to conquer and control. They all seem to feed into each other, creating this narrative of suspicion and domination that just permeates so much of history.
And those narratives, they often play out in surprisingly specific ways. Take, for example, those Sheila na gig sculptures we talked about earlier, those ancient, often erotic depictions of female figures, primarily found on islands. They represent a form of cultural expression that survived longer on the fringes, defying mainland attempts at suppression.
It's as if those islands provided this kind of protective buffer, a space where those older traditions could endure, even as they were being eroded on the mainland. They become these repositories of cultural memory, preserving what's been lost or forgotten elsewhere.
Exactly. And it's not just cultural expressions that find refuge on these islands, they also become havens for political resistance, especially during times of upheaval. Think about the English Civil War, when both Charles I and his son Prince Charles sought refuge on islands like the Isles of Scilly Jersey and the Isle of Wight.
It's remarkable how these seemingly remote outposts suddenly become central to the power struggles unfolding on the mainland. It really highlights the interconnectedness of history, how even those on the margins can play such a crucial role in shaping the course of events.
And what's even more fascinating is how those island experiences shaped the individuals involved. Remember that poignant description of Charles I unbuoying his son on the Isle of Wight, preparing him for a life of potential exile. That moment encapsulates the profound impact these islands had on those who sought refuge there.
It's such a powerful image, and it speaks to the deep sense of displacement, uncertainty, even a kind of forced maturity that these islands imposed on those who sought refuge there. It's a reminder that history isn't just about kings and queens and battles. It's about individual lives, personal experiences, and the way those are shaped by the places we inhabit.
Absolutely. And those individual stories, particularly those from the margins, they often challenge us to rethink our assumptions about the past. They offer a different perspective, a glimpse into the lives and experiences of those who are often overlooked in traditional historical accounts.
And speaking of overlooked perspectives, we keep coming back to this theme of women ruling islands. It's a recurring motif in folklore mythology, even the theater of the time. Why do you think this archetype continues to fascinate us?
Well, it's clearly a powerful image, one that taps into something deep within the human psyche. These figures, the ancient priestesses of Scilly controlling the winds, the ladies of the lake in Arthurian legend wielding mystical power, they embody a different kind of authority, one that's rooted in nature, intuition, and a connection to the unseen world.
It's like they represent this alternative to the patriarchal power structures that have dominated society for so long. They offer a vision of leadership that's more in tune with the rhythms of nature, less focused on control and domination, and more attuned to the needs of the community.
And perhaps that's why these figures are both celebrated and feared. They offer a glimpse of a different way of being, a different way of relating to power. And that can be both alluring and unsettling to those accustomed to traditional hierarchies.
That makes you wonder if those stories served as a kind of cultural safety valve, a way to explore those alternative models of leadership without directly challenging the established order. It's like saying, yes, there are other ways to lead, other sources of power, but let's keep them safely contained within the realm of myth and legend.
That's a very insightful observation. But it's also important to remember that these stories were often told by men, shaped by their own perspectives and anxieties. So even as they celebrate female power, they often do so within the confines of patriarchal narratives. It's a complex dynamic, reflecting those broader societal tensions surrounding gender and power during that era, and those tensions are still very much with us today.
Absolutely. The fight for equal representation, the right to lead, the freedom to define our own roles in society. These are battles that have been waged for centuries, and they continue to this day. It's sobering to realize how deeply ingrained those patterns of power and inequality are.
It is. But it's also empowering to see how women throughout history have resisted those constraints, carving out spaces for themselves, whether on literal islands or in the realm of ideas.
And that brings us back to Albinia's provocative statement. We are still in the 16th century mindset of discovery, colonization, and exploitation. It's a sobering reminder that the legacy of that era continues to shape our world, even if we're not always aware of it.
It's easy to get caught up in that narrative of progress, to believe that we've moved beyond those outdated ways of thinking. But when we look around, we see those same patterns repeating themselves. The exploitation of natural resources, the marginalization of certain groups, the relentless pursuit of power and profit at the expense of others. It's as if those 16th century impulses are woven into the fabric of our modern world.
But Albinia also offers a glimmer of hope, doesn't she? She points to examples of cultures that lived in greater harmony with nature, respecting the interconnectedness of all things. The Sami people, for instance. They didn't need grand structures to worship. They saw the sacred in the natural world itself.
Those alternative ways of being, those different ways of relating to power and to the earth, they offer a path forward, a way to break free from those destructive patterns of the past. They remind us that there are other ways to be in the world, other ways to relate to each other and to the planet.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Britannias. It's amazing how these island stories, often seen as just like these side notes in history, can actually reveal so much about the bigger picture. You know?
You really do.
It's like you're peering through this tiny keyhole, and suddenly this whole world unfolds before you.
It's like holding up a magnifying glass to these seemingly peripheral spaces,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden the whole world is reflected back at you.
Exactly. And one of the most striking reflections we keep encountering is this tension between mainland power and island resistance. It's a dynamic that plays out on so many levels, from cultural expressions to political allegiances. It's like this constant push and pull.
Yeah, like a dance almost.
Yeah, between those who want to control everything and those who are fighting to hold on to their unique identities.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is how often these islands become repositories for what's been suppressed or marginalized on the mainland.
Right.
You know, it's like they offer this space for those alternative voices, those different ways of being, to actually persist, to thrive, even in the face of all this pressure to conform.
Think about those Sheila and I Giggs sculptures again.
Oh, yeah.
Those ancient, often erotic depictions of women, predominantly found on islands.
Yeah.
They speak to this cultural expression that completely defied mainland norms.
They did.
They're like these bold, unapologetic statements of female power just staring back at us across the centuries.
And it's not just those ancient traditions that find sanctuary on these islands. We see this dynamic play out in more recent history as well, like during the English Civil War. The islands became havens for both sides of the conflict, offering refuge and strategic advantage.
You know, that story of Charles the unbuoying his son on the Isle of Wight is particularly poignant, I think.
It is.
It captures that sense of displacement, of uncertainty that just really characterized that era.
It does.
And the fact that families on Sixolini, they still trace their lineage back to that period.
I know, it's amazing.
Speaks to the lasting impact of those island experiences, how they shape identity and memory across generations.
They really do. It's a reminder that history isn't just this collection of abstract events. It's lived experience, you know, passed down through generations, shaping the identities of these communities and individuals in these really profound ways.
And those island experiences, they often challenge us to kind of rethink our understanding of the past.
They do.
They force us to consider those perspectives of people who were often marginalized or silenced in the traditional historical accounts.
Right.
You know, they offer this much richer, more nuanced understanding of history.
Absolutely. And one group whose voices we often struggle to hear are women.
That's true.
Throughout the Britannias, we encounter this recurring theme of women ruling islands. This motif that appears in folklore and mythology, even in the theater of the time.
It's everywhere.
It is. And these figures, they're often portrayed as powerful, mysterious Emeris, deeply connected to nature.
Yeah.
And they challenge our assumptions about leadership and authority.
Those figures, the ancient priestesses of Scilly controlling the winds, the ladies of the lake in Arthurian legend, wielding this mystical power. they represent a different kind of authority,
Right. One that's often misunderstood or feared.
especially by those in power.
Exactly. What's really intriguing, though, is how these portrayals of female leadership are
Yeah.
often contradictory.
In what way?
Well, on the one hand, there's this celebration of their power, their connection to nature, their wisdom and intuition.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's this deep-seated fear of their influence.
Okay.
A sense that their power is somehow dangerous or unstable, a threat to the established order.
It's like society couldn't quite reconcile itself to the idea of women holding true authority.
It couldn't.
So they were kind of relegated to these mythical realms
Right to these island spaces.
where their power could be both acknowledged and contained.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that these stories were often told by men,
Of course.
shaped by their perspectives and anxiety. It really is. And the stories in the Britannias, they remind us that these struggles aren't new. That these patterns of domination and resistance, they've been playing out for a very long time.
It's sobering to realize how deeply ingrained those patterns of power and inequality really are. But it's also empowering to see how women throughout history have resisted those constraints. They've carved out these spaces for themselves, whether on literal islands or in the realm of ideas. They remind us that change is possible,
It is.
that we're not bound by the limitations of the past.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to Albinia's statement that we are still in the 16th century mindset of discovery, colonization, and exploitation. It's a stark reminder that the legacy of that era continues to shape our world, even if we're not always aware of it.
It's so easy to get caught up in that narrative of progress,
Yeah.
to believe that we've moved beyond those outdated ways of thinking. But when we look around, we see those same patterns repeating themselves, don't we?
We do.
The exploitation of natural resources, the marginalization of certain groups, the relentless pursuit of power and profit at the expense of others. It's like those 16th century impulses are woven into the very fabric of our modern world.
But Albinia, she also offers us a glimmer of hope. She points to these examples of cultures that lived in greater harmony with nature, respecting the interconnectedness of all things. The Sami people, for instance, they didn't need these grand structures to worship. They saw the sacred in the natural world itself, in the rocks, the rivers, the trees.
Yeah, they remind us that there are other ways to be in the world, other ways to relate to each other and to the planet.
Exactly, those alternative ways of being, those different ways of relating to power and to the earth, they offer us a path forward, a way to break free from those destructive patterns of the past. They invite us to rethink our relationship with the natural world, to consider the consequences of our actions, and to seek a more sustainable and equitable way of life.
It's a path that requires us to challenge our assumptions, to decolonize our minds, to listen to those voices that have been silenced for too long. The voices of indigenous peoples, of women, of those who have been marginalized and exploited. It's a journey of rediscovery. A process of unearthing the wisdom that's been buried beneath all those layers of historical baggage.
And as we embark on this journey, we can draw inspiration from those island stories. Those tales of resilience, of resistance, of the enduring human spirit. They remind us that even in the face of adversity, even on the margins, it's possible to create those spaces of hope, of connection, of possibility.
Yeah, they challenge us to imagine a different future, one that's more sustainable and more in tune with the interconnectedness of all things.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the Britannias.
It has been a journey.
It really has. We've covered so much ground, from those spiritual upheavals of the Reformation to the brutal realities of colonialism and that enduring allure of those island women who dared to defy convention. But ultimately, we're left with this profound sense of both the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. It's a call to action,
It is.
an invitation to engage with our history, to learn from the past, and to create a future that honors the interconnectedness of all beings and the preciousness of this planet we call home.
It's a beautiful thought.
We encourage you to explore the Britannias for yourselves and to continue this journey of discovery. And be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more explorations into fascinating topics just like this one. Until next time, keep diving.